The radio crackles with my son's voice, barely a whisper. Mom, she's on this flight. Still, the words linger, as the line suddenly goes dead. As I clutch the receiver, my hand shakes, heart racing. Ethan, my son, the pilot, never speaks like this. While the silence drowns me, the weight of his fear settles in. The woman he's still haunted by, his ex-wife, is on that plane. That's when it hits. She's not just targeting him anymore. She's coming for both of us, and I'm powerless to stop it. We're about to begin, but if you'd like, share where you're joining from. It reminds me this story doesn't echo into silence. It lands somewhere real. Drop it in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe. Elaine Foster stood by the kitchen counter, her fingers wrapped around a cold mug of coffee that had long since lost its warmth. The rain tapped against the windows, a soft rhythmic patter that barely registered in her mind. Outside, the world was a blur of gray clouds, as though the sky itself shared her sense of unease. She glanced at the clock. Ethan's flight from Seattle to Denver was supposed to be smooth, routine, the kind of trip she'd taken for granted so many times before. But that had been before. Before Mara. Before the wreckage she'd left in their lives. Elaine's phone buzzed, the sudden vibration slicing through the quiet of the house. Her heart skipped a beat. She had expected a call from Ethan, but not like this. Not now. She answered on the first ring. Ethan? There was a crackling silence on the other end, followed by a shaky breath. Then his voice. It was unsteady, strained in a way she'd never heard before. Mom. She's on this flight. Elaine's grip tightened around the phone, her pulse quickening. She could hear the faint hum of airplane engines in the background, the distant buzz of a radio, but the words he'd spoken were enough to freeze her. What do you mean, Ethan? Who? Mara, he said, the word a low whisper, laden with panic. Seat 14B. I don't know how she got through security. Elaine's blood ran cold. Mara. Of course, her son's ex-wife, the woman who had torn through his life like a storm, leaving nothing but wreckage in her wake. Elaine had always feared this day would come, but hearing it now, spoken by Ethan's trembling voice, made it all too real. She swallowed hard. Are you sure? Are you sure it's her? Ethan hesitated. Then his voice broke, sharp and frantic. Mom, if anything happens... His words were cut off by a sharp, muffled noise. Elaine's breath caught in her throat. A female voice, loud, shrill, erupted from the background, a jarring contrast to Ethan's normally composed demeanor. There was yelling now, screaming, the unmistakable sound of panic and violence threading through the static. Elaine's heart pounded in her chest. Ethan, listen to me. What's happening? What's going on? She gripped the phone tighter, leaning against the counter as if the force of her body could somehow push the fear out of her. The line crackled again, the tension building as the argument in the background escalated. Ethan's breath came in ragged bursts, desperate. She's not just on the flight, Mom. She's doing something. I don't know. His voice faltered. A loud bang echoed through the line, followed by a thud. Elaine's stomach twisted, a cold lump forming in her throat. Don't! Ethan's voice was a low rasp now, barely audible. Mom, I need you to... And then the line went dead. Elaine stared at the screen, her heart hammering in her chest, the weight of the silence heavier than any words could have been. She could still feel the tremor in his voice, the terror. Her son, her strong, dependable son, had never sounded like that before. He was in danger. She knew it as surely as she knew the air she breathed. But where? And what was Mara doing on that flight? How had she managed to slip past the most basic of checks? Her thoughts scrambled, too fast, too frantic to form a coherent plan. Elaine tried to call Ethan back, but there was nothing. No ringing, no voicemail, just an endless, terrifying silence. She paced the kitchen, gripping the edge of the counter, her mind racing. Her eyes darted to the phone again, willing it to ring, to bring her some answer, any answer. But there was only the relentless, crushing quiet. A knock at the door broke through the tension, startling her. Elaine jumped, then quickly moved to open it. Detective Ryan Hale stood in the doorway, his expression unreadable but sharp. He had been on the case ever since Mara had resurfaced, and despite his stoic demeanor, Elaine could tell he was rattled. He looked at her, his dark eyes intense. "Elaine, what's going on? I just got the call. The flight landed, but Ethan, he's not answering." Elaine cut him off, her voice hoarse. She stepped aside to let him in. "He called me. She's on the flight. Mara, she's there. She was in seat 14B. She swallowed hard, trying to steady herself. "I don't know what's happening, but I'm scared, Detective. I think she's trying to do something to him. I—" Her voice cracked as the fear she had been holding back for so long finally began to spill out. Hale's jaw tightened. "We'll find him, but we need to act quickly." Elaine nodded, trying to breathe through the panic constricting her chest. I need to get to Denver. Now. I need to know he's okay." Hale hesitated, then stepped forward, his hand gripping her arm gently but firmly. "We'll do everything we can, Elaine, but we need to think this through. We don't know what Mara's capable of. Not yet." Elaine nodded again, the words not sinking in. She was already moving toward the door, already imagining Ethan's terrified face. She had always kept him safe, always been the one to stand between him and whatever nightmares his ex-wife could conjure. But now, she was helpless. She had to get to him, had to make sure Mara couldn't reach him first. The storm outside raged louder, the rain beating against the windows, a reflection of the storm brewing in Elaine's mind. The radio silence between her and her son hung in the air like a threat she couldn't escape. And deep down, Elaine knew one thing for certain. The worst was yet to come. Elaine's breath was shallow, her heart hammering in her chest as she sprinted through the terminal. The airport was chaotic, filled with the usual blend of hurried travelers, overhead announcements, and the clatter of rolling luggage. But for Elaine, the world had narrowed into a tunnel, focused entirely on the singular, terrifying goal: finding Ethan. And now, she had only one chance. The flashing neon lights above her blinked erratically, casting an unsettling glow as she pushed past rows of people. She couldn't afford to waste a second. Couldn't let Mara get any closer to him. Elaine burst through the doors of the terminal's security office, her mind a chaotic blur of panic and desperate hope. The officer behind the desk barely looked up as she skidded to a halt. "I need to speak to someone in charge. Now," she demanded, her voice raw. The officer didn't even flinch. "Ma'am, you'll have to— Do you not understand? My son's life is in danger." Elaine's words spilled out, her breath catching in her throat. "He called me from the plane. Something's wrong. You need to help me." The officer finally registered the urgency in her tone. He stood up slowly, holding up his hands as if to calm her, though it had the opposite effect. Okay. Let me get someone." Elaine's eyes darted toward the gate. Her fingers trembled as she reached for her phone. She glanced at it again, expecting a miracle. But the screen was still dead. Empty. Nothing. The seconds felt like hours. A few minutes later, an airport supervisor, a middle-aged woman with thin-framed glasses, appeared from a side door. Her expression was professional, but her eyes betrayed a flicker of concern. "Ma'am, can I help you?" Elaine barely took a breath before she blurted out, "My son's on flight 782. He's a pilot. He called me while he was in the air. He said his ex-wife, Mara, was on the plane. She's dangerous. You need to get me some answers now. The supervisor blinked, then shook her head. Ma'am, pilots don't make personal calls in the air, it's against protocol. Maybe there's been some kind of misunderstanding. Elaine felt the words hit her like a slap. I'm telling you, she's on that flight. He wouldn't lie about this. You have to check. She reached for her phone and pulled up the voicemail from Ethan's call. With shaking hands, she pressed play. Ethan's voice filled the small, sterile room, his voice cracking under pressure. The moment his desperate words hit the air, the supervisor froze, her eyes widening as she heard the tension, the terror in his voice. The supervisor quickly grabbed the phone, holding it up to her ear as her face paled. She listened, her fingers trembling on the edge of the screen. After a moment, she lowered the phone and looked at Elaine, her expression one of disbelief. I'll call security, she said, her voice now tight, worried. Elaine barely registered the words, her mind still on Ethan's voice, on the awful silence that had followed. The voicemail had given them nothing more than a brief, desperate warning. Nothing to explain the shouting, the banging noises, the fear that still rang in her ears. Seconds later, the supervisor returned with a security officer. She exchanged a few words with him, and they moved toward a nearby monitor. Elaine felt her pulse spike, a knot of dread pulling her gut down to her feet as the images on the screen flickered to life. The camera feed from the gate showed passengers walking past. A blur of faces, none of them familiar, until the footage zoomed in on a woman with a dark ponytail, wearing a gray hoodie and dark sunglasses, walking with purpose toward the boarding tunnel. Is that Mara? Elaine's voice was barely a whisper. The security officer didn't say anything, but he reached for the controls, slowing the footage. It was hard to make out much of her face, but there was something in her posture, in the way she moved, that made Elaine's stomach twist. It was her. It had to be. The supervisor squinted at the monitor. Wait, that's not right. The name on the boarding pass is different. It doesn't match. Elaine's pulse quickened. What do you mean? What's different? Her last name. It's not under Mara Albright, the supervisor said, her voice tight. It's someone else entirely. Elaine's breath caught. How did she? Before she could finish the thought, the security officer was already on the phone, speaking rapidly into the receiver. We need to alert the flight crew. Something's off. Fast. Elaine's world shifted beneath her feet, and for a moment, everything felt dizzying, surreal. She got through security. She was on the flight, under a different name. What does that mean? What does she want? Detective Hale's voice broke through the fog of panic as he entered the room. He was already scanning the footage, his eyes narrowing. Elaine, what have we got? The supervisor handed him the phone, and he listened intently, his face stone cold. After a moment, he turned to Elaine. We need to speak with the flight crew. Now. If Mara's on that plane, it's not just a threat to Ethan. This is bigger. Elaine felt the weight of his words. What are you saying? Her voice trembled. Is she going after him again? Hale's eyes hardened. She nearly destroyed him once. She will do it again. Elaine's breath hitched. We have to stop her. Hale turned to the supervisor. Get the flight crew, now. The supervisor nodded quickly, already moving. Hale glanced back at Elaine, his expression grim. If she's done what I think she's done, we have a serious problem. Elaine felt the blood drain from her face. She had always feared this moment. But now, with the pieces falling into place, the terror felt more real than ever. The quiet hum of the airport around them became suffocating. The storm outside was nothing compared to the storm building in Elaine's chest. Mara wasn't just on that flight. She had slipped through every system, every checkpoint, and was now somewhere on that plane with Ethan. And whatever she was planning, Elaine knew it was only the beginning. The clock was ticking. The fluorescent lights above flickered, casting an uneven glow over the stark white walls of the small airport security room. The quiet hum of the ventilation system only made the tension heavier. Elaine sat at a small, sterile desk, her hands clutching the edge as if it were the only thing holding her upright. Detective Hale stood opposite her, leaning against the wall, his posture tight but controlled. The weight of their situation was unbearable, but they both knew they had no choice but to keep moving forward. Elaine could feel the bile rise in her throat as the memories surged. Too many of them. Every time she thought about Mara, the images were like fragments of a nightmare, each one more sinister than the last. Mara's history isn't just bad, Elaine began, her voice a little stronger now, though the words felt like they were tearing at her insides. It's dangerous. Hale's gaze sharpened. He'd been listening intently since the moment they'd uncovered Mara's presence on the flight, but now he seemed to be absorbing every detail, filing it away like pieces of a puzzle. Elaine took a slow, steadying breath before continuing, her voice almost a whisper. It started with small things. Suspicious behavior. She was always charming, but it never felt right. Then, it escalated. I found out she was using fake documents to steal money from Ethan's accounts. Fraud. Hale. She was siphoning off his salary bit by bit. Hale's eyes narrowed. I didn't know she had that kind of access. Elaine shook her head, regret lacing her words. She'd convinced him that it was all a mistake, that it was her way of helping him manage his finances, but Ethan didn't see it until it was too late. Her eyes turned distant, and for a moment, she wasn't in the room with Hale anymore. She was back there, watching as Ethan's once bright future seemed to slip away, piece by piece. When I found out, I confronted her. That's when things got worse. Worse? Hale asked, his tone low, dangerous. Elaine's lips pressed into a thin line. She threatened Ethan, told him that if he didn't keep quiet, she'd ruin his career. It wasn't just the money, it was his reputation. She made sure to destroy everything that made him who he was. Hale listened without interruption, his eyes flicking to the door, checking to make sure no one else was listening. He knew what this meant. It wasn't just about sabotage. It was about control. And Mara had always been in control, pulling the strings from the shadows. Elaine's fingers trembled as she wiped her face. When she wasn't threatening him financially, she was violent. She'd hit him. Sometimes just in fits of rage, other times when she wanted him to be afraid. I knew she was dangerous, but I had no idea how deep it ran. Hale's face softened, just slightly, though he was clearly processing every word. What about the mental health issues? He asked carefully. Elaine's chest tightened. She was in and out of psychiatric holds. Voluntary, involuntary. You name it. She'd get into fights at bars and the police would have to take her away. But the courts always found a way to let her go. Ethan kept trying to protect her, even when she was the one destroying him. Her voice cracked as she continued. But the worst part? The lies she told about Ethan. The things she claimed he did. That's why he divorced her. She sabotaged his career by telling people at his company that he had a history of abuse and, well, they almost fired him. Hale's jaw tightened. But you said she disappeared after the court case? Elaine nodded, her eyes haunted. Yeah, 14 months ago. After she lost a huge court case against him, she vanished. We all thought we were finally rid of her. But now? Her throat constricted, and she couldn't finish the thought. Hale's face was unreadable, but there was an edge to his voice when he spoke again. So her being on that flight isn't coincidence. It wasn't a question. Elaine's hands were shaking, her nails digging into the palms of her hands. She swallowed the lump in her throat. No, she's been following him. He told me so. She called him from burner numbers, threatening to expose him, to ruin him where he works. And now, this. She met Hale's gaze, her voice trembling. She's targeting him again, and I don't know how much longer he can survive it. Hale stood up straight, running a hand over his face. His mind was already calculating the possibilities, the scenarios they hadn't even considered. I'll make the call to the flight crew. We need to know exactly where she is on that plane and what she's doing. He turned on his heel, heading for the door. Elaine watched him go, her stomach tightening as dread pooled in the pit of her stomach. She had been living in fear of this moment, but now that it had arrived, she was numb. How had things gone so far? But even as the door clicked shut behind Hale, Elaine could hear the faint hum of the phone ringing in the corner. She glanced up, holding her breath. The sound was too quiet, too final. The minutes that passed felt like an eternity. And then, the silence shattered when Hale's voice came through the intercom. His tone was flat, but the cold edge was unmistakable. No response from the cockpit. Elaine's heart froze. It felt as though the ground beneath her feet had slipped away, and the fear that had been gnawing at her chest now gripped her fully. Mara was on that plane, and she was making her move. The seconds stretched on, each one more agonizing than the last. What was Mara doing? What did she want? And where was Ethan? The room seemed to close in on Elaine as she clung to the one thought that screamed in her mind. No one had been able to stop Mara before. What if they couldn't stop her now? The clock was ticking, and every second felt like it could be the one that changed everything. The quiet hum of the airport seemed almost oppressive now, as if the very air had thickened with dread. The airport was still bustling, but for Elaine, it was as if everything around her had fallen away, leaving only the hollow sound of her own heartbeat. She paced the small security office, eyes flicking to the clock on the wall every few seconds. Time felt elastic, stretching in ways it shouldn't. She had to focus, had to think clearly, but the weight of the unknown was crushing her. Detective Hale, as if sensing her unraveling, was already on the phone, his voice low, commanding. He was speaking with a team of airport personnel, coordinating without breaking his calm facade. It was clear that the situation was escalating, but there was little Elaine could do to stop it. The decisions were being made far away from her, and she had no choice but to follow. Behind them, the flight's data on a nearby screen flickered, showing the trajectory of Flight 782. A plane she should have felt safe about. An everyday flight. But now, every number, every graphic, felt like a ticking bomb. The seconds felt like years. Elaine's mind kept flashing to Mara, who had managed to slip under the radar again, appearing at the worst possible time. There was no way Mara was just another passenger. This was something far more calculated, something malicious. Elaine's stomach churned as she thought about the suitcase she'd seen on the baggage list. It was an innocuous entry, just another item of luggage being processed, except it had never been claimed. No one had picked it up. Mara's suitcase. She could feel her chest tightening, the world around her slipping into a dizzying blur. Why would she leave her luggage? Elaine muttered under her breath, her eyes still glued to the screen. She felt the weight of the question pressing down on her like a vice. Hale, now off the phone, glanced at her. She's doing this on purpose, Elaine. This isn't just about causing chaos in the air, it's personal. Elaine looked up at him sharply, her breath coming in shallow bursts. What do you mean? What does she want? Hale's jaw tightened, his eyes steely. She's cornering Ethan, not just physically, mentally. She's going to put him in a situation where he can't escape. Where he'll have no choice but to face her. And her version of the truth. Elaine felt a cold chill wash over her. She's not going to stop, is she? Not until she's done whatever she came here to do. Hale gave her a measured look, his expression a perfect blend of caution and concern. No, she won't. And if we don't act fast enough... The rest of his sentence hung in the air, unspoken. Elaine turned away, staring at the monitor. The flight's descent had begun. The plane was on its way down to Denver, and there was nothing they could do to stop it. Not yet. Not until they had answers. She couldn't help it. Her thoughts spiraled again, back to Ethan. Back to the fear she had seen in his voice when he'd called her. That same dread filled her now, gnawing at her insides, a constant, pulsing reminder that she wasn't anywhere near close enough to him. 10 minutes. Hale's voice cut through her thoughts, and she looked up. What? The flight is descending. 10 minutes to landing, Hale said, his voice carefully neutral. But the lines around his mouth were taut with tension. He was just as aware as she was that this was the calm before the storm. Elaine clenched her fists at her sides, trying to steady her breathing. She felt the cold bite of fear at the back of her neck, the same instinctual dread she had experienced 1,000 times before whenever Mara had crossed their path. The minutes crawled. 10 minutes stretched into eternity, a heavy silence filling the room. Elaine's thoughts spiraled again to Ethan, to that desperate, shaking voice he had used when he called. The gnawing feeling in her stomach twisted as she imagined what could be happening up there, high above the clouds. Every second, every breath felt like it could be the one to change everything. Her heart pounded, and she could feel herself becoming lightheaded. With shaking hands, she reached for the railing beside her. The cold metal grounded her, but only just. Her knees wobbled, and she could feel the strength draining from her body. She closed her eyes for a moment, willing herself to stay focused, to hold on for just a little longer. But then, the voice came. The voice that snapped her back to reality, back to the threat that hung over them all. Flight 782 is descending normally, a voice from the intercom said, breaking the unbearable silence like a needle through a taut wire. Elaine's heart skipped a beat as the words hit her. Normal? The relief that washed over her was so brief, so fleeting that it felt hollow. She felt her breath catch in her throat. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. She had no idea what Mara was planning, no idea how deep her machinations ran, but she knew one thing for certain. This was only the beginning. She glanced over at Hale, who was already striding towards the door. His jaw was tight, his steps purposeful. "We have to meet the plane," he said without looking back. "We don't know what's waiting for us when they land." Elaine followed him, her heart still pounding in her chest. Her breath came quick, shallow, but she forced herself to steady it. This wasn't over yet. They still had time to stop Mara, if they could get to her before she got to Ethan. But with every second it was becoming clearer. Mara wasn't just going to make a scene. She wasn't here for an outburst or a fit of rage. She was here to destroy. And with each passing moment, the walls were closing in. The roar of the plane's engines faded as it touched down on the runway, a jarring contrast to the tension that had built to a near-frenzied pitch in the security room. Elaine's eyes were fixed on the monitor that showed Flight 782's final descent into Denver. For a split second, the steady descent felt almost normal, too routine to match the storm brewing inside her. Hale stood beside her, his posture rigid, his jaw clenched as he watched the plane's trajectory with the same intensity she felt in her bones. His hand rested on the phone in his pocket, ready to move as soon as the plane had landed. But as the plane's wheels hit the tarmac, Elaine couldn't shake the feeling that something was deeply wrong. She'd been holding her breath for what felt like hours, bracing for a confrontation, for the worst kind of news. Her mind kept returning to Ethan's voice, to the faintest hint of terror she had heard. And now, as the plane taxied toward the gate, all of it felt even more impossible to comprehend. The gate doors opened and passengers began to file out. Elaine's pulse hammered as she strained to see the faces of those disembarking. She was looking for one face, one familiar, fragile face. Ethan. But he didn't come. The sea of passengers shuffled forward, tired, indifferent, unaware of the horror unfolding around them. Elaine's breath hitched as the crowd thinned, and she looked at Hale. His expression was unreadable, but the sharpness in his eyes spoke volumes. He was scanning the passengers, the confusion clearly mirrored in his own gaze. The woman from seat 14B, the one Ethan had described, wasn't there. Elaine's heart skipped a beat. She moved toward the area where passengers had gathered, her eyes darting from face to face, her breath coming in short gasps. The closer they got to the exit, the more her fear tightened its grip. But then, there. A woman stepped off the plane, dressed in dark clothes, wearing large sunglasses and a hood that obscured most of her features. Elaine froze. She felt a sickening lurch in her stomach. Could it be? No, it wasn't Mara. It couldn't be. Hale was already moving, a step ahead. He approached the woman with purposeful stride, his voice cutting through the low murmur of conversation. "Excuse me, ma'am. Can I see your boarding pass?" Elaine's heart pounded in her chest as she watched the woman's expression shift, flickering with something she couldn't quite identify. There was a moment, just a flash, where it was like the woman knew exactly who they were, knew what was coming. She handed Hale the pass without hesitation. His eyes scanned the boarding pass. His face tightened. "Seat 14B, he muttered under his breath. His gaze flicked back up to the woman studying her. Elaine took a step forward, closer now, her pulse racing. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that maybe, just maybe, this was all a game, a twisted game, and they were all pawns in it. Hale's voice was low but edged with disbelief. "This isn't Mara." Elaine's eyes widened. "What?" He looked back at the woman. "No, this isn't her." Ethan recognized the wrong person. Elaine's breath caught in her throat. Ethan never made mistakes like that. He never got things like this wrong. The weight of that realization hit her like a punch to the gut. The woman's lips curled into a thin, almost amused smile. She pushed her sunglasses up the bridge of her nose, revealing her eyes. Cold, calculating, but not the eyes of someone who was lost, not the eyes of a victim. They were the eyes of someone who had known exactly what they were doing all along. She spoke quietly, as if the situation was nothing more than an inconvenience. "Someone switched seats with me at the last second," she said, her voice a smooth, clipped monotone. "I didn't ask for it, but someone else did. I was just sitting there. You're looking for Mara, aren't you?" Elaine felt her stomach drop. The words seemed to take a moment to sink in. "You." She trailed off, unable to find the right words, her mind spinning. "So, where is she?" The woman's smile didn't waver. "Mara," she said with a quiet smirk, "is already long gone." Elaine's world seemed to tilt on its axis. "Gone?" she whispered, barely able to form the words. Her throat was dry. The weight of what the woman was implying was slowly taking shape in her mind. The woman handed Hale the boarding pass. "You'll find the name doesn't match. It's a fake one. Mara used a decoy. She was never on that plane." She turned to walk away, her pace leisurely, as if she hadn't just dropped a bombshell that threatened to implode everything Elaine had believed was true. Hale turned to Elaine, his eyes cold, calculating, as if he had already connected the dots. "She used a decoy," he repeated, his voice hard. "Meaning Mara's already somewhere else, somewhere we can't see. And we've been looking in the wrong place." Elaine's legs felt weak beneath her. She gripped the nearest railing to steady herself. The words were still reverberating in her mind, but her body couldn't process them fast enough. This was all wrong. Everything was wrong. She had been so close, and now Mara had just slipped through their fingers. And somewhere, out there, Mara was watching them as they scrambled to catch up with her. Elaine's chest tightened. "What does she want, Hale?" she asked, her voice a strained whisper. "What is she doing?" Hale's gaze darkened. "Whatever it is, she's playing us, and we're not prepared for what's coming next." Elaine could feel the weight of his words settling in like a cold stone in her chest. But in that moment, there was one thing she knew for certain. They weren't done yet. The game had only just begun. The last passenger trickled off the plane, their faces a blur of indifference, as if nothing extraordinary had just unfolded. Elaine stood frozen, her chest tight, her gaze darting from one figure to the next, desperately searching for Ethan. But he wasn't among them. The chaos of bodies and luggage felt suffocating, every step further away from the answer she so desperately needed. "Where is he?" she whispered to herself, a knot of dread forming in her throat. Hale's voice cut through the haze. "We need to check the plane, now." He was already moving, pushing past the passengers who still milled about, seemingly oblivious to the gravity of the situation. Elaine followed, her mind in a haze, trying to breathe through the sudden sense of panic that threatened to overwhelm her. They were at the gate now, a few airport personnel standing by, watching with curiosity as Hale flashed his badge and spoke sharply to the crew. Elaine's heart hammered in her chest, each beat louder than the last. They couldn't waste time. Ethan had to be here. He had to be. "Where's the rest of the crew?" Hale demanded. "They've already gone through customs, Detective," one of the attendants replied, looking confused. "There's no sign of him in the terminal." "Did he disembark with the crew?" Hale asked, his voice more insistent. The attendant shook her head. "No, sir, he didn't." Elaine's stomach lurched. "What do you mean he didn't? He has to be here. He's the pilot. He should have been one of the first off the plane." Hale's gaze hardened as he turned to Elaine, his voice low but edged with a grim resolve. "There's no sign he ever disembarked." He said it as if the words themselves had weight, and with them, the finality of the situation set in. "We've been looking in the wrong place." Elaine's mind spiraled. She grabbed for the nearest chair, her knees giving way as she collapsed into it, shaking. Her fingers gripped the armrests, but they didn't steady her. Her body trembled violently as the horror of what Hale had just said sank in. Ethan was gone. He had never left the plane. And if he hadn't disembarked, then where the hell was he? A cold sweat covered her brow as panic bloomed in her chest. Hale moved with purpose, barking orders into his phone, his expression tight. Elaine could barely hear him. All she could hear was the pounding of her own heartbeat, the buzzing in her ears, the gnawing uncertainty that Mara was one step ahead of them. The airport terminal felt like it was closing in on her, the air thick with the weight of unanswered questions. Then, just as she was about to lose herself to the chaos, her phone buzzed in her pocket. She fumbled to pull it out, her hands shaking so violently that the screen blurred in her vision. She glanced at the notification, her stomach dropping to the floor as her eyes locked onto the message that flickered in front of her. It was a post from Mara's old social media account, the account she thought had been abandoned, wiped clean when Mara had disappeared 14 months ago. "You took so much from me. I'm ready to collect." Elaine's breath caught in her throat, and she read the words again, her pulse quickening. The meaning behind them unfurled in her mind like a cruel joke, each word a slap in the face. Mara wasn't after Ethan. She hadn't been trying to destroy him. She hadn't been chasing him. No, Mara had been after her all along. Elaine felt as though the world had shifted beneath her, as if the floor had suddenly disappeared, leaving her suspended in air. "She's after me," she realized, the cold truth settling in with terrifying clarity. Her hands shook as she pulled the phone closer, staring at the message again. The screen seemed to distort in her vision as her mind raced. The years of manipulation, the lies, the destruction that Mara had left in her wake. All of it had been to get to Elaine. The quiet threat of her final words echoed in Elaine's mind, as if Mara had been playing a long game that Elaine had only now begun to understand. Elaine's throat constricted, her vision narrowing as her thoughts scattered. She had spent so long trying to protect Ethan, trying to shield him from Mara's wrath, but the truth was far worse than she had imagined. Mara wasn't done with her yet. The realization hit her like a freight train, and she felt a wave of nausea rise in her chest. Ethan's gone, she thought. But why? Where is he? The sound of Hale's voice broke through her panic, but his words felt distant, muffled, as if they came from underwater. He was asking someone for an update, pushing them for answers. But Elaine couldn't focus on that right now. Her hands fumbled for her phone again, pulling up the search history, looking for some hint. Some way out of this labyrinth that Mara had spun. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't think. She's coming for me. Elaine. Hale's voice finally broke through, sharp and clear. She looked up, seeing him move toward her with a look that she didn't fully understand. We're going to find him. We have to move now. But all Elaine could think about was the message, the reality of Mara's game. And the horrifying realization that Mara's twisted plot had only just begun. The clock was ticking, and they were running out of time. The drive back from the airport was a blur. Rain-slicked streets and flashing lights that seemed to swirl and melt together, leaving Elaine in a haze. The weight of the last few hours pressed on her chest like a physical burden. Ethan was missing. Mara was playing some game she couldn't understand, and the threats she'd woven so expertly had now turned from vague to real. The police car followed closely behind, the officer inside casting nervous glances in the rearview mirror, as if trying to reassure himself that nothing was amiss. Elaine barely noticed. She couldn't shake the chilling feeling that had settled in her stomach. A gnawing emptiness that had only deepened since the post from Mara's social media account. She's after me. Elaine's thoughts kept racing in circles, trying to piece together how this had all spiraled so far out of control. She had thought she was protecting Ethan, but in the end, it was always her Mara wanted. By the time they arrived home, the rain had turned into a torrential downpour, the kind that blurred everything, making the world feel submerged, suffocated. Elaine stepped out of the car, her legs unsteady, as though her body hadn't fully caught up to the fact that she was standing on solid ground. Hale was already out of his car, his sharp eyes scanning the house from the curb. "Elaine," he said, his voice cutting through the noise of the rain. "Stay close. We don't know what we're walking into." She nodded without speaking, her eyes fixed on the front door. It was slightly ajar. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up. Hale moved ahead, reaching for his weapon as he approached the door, his hand steady. Elaine followed, her heart thundering in her chest. The last time she had seen the door like this, half open as if someone had just walked out, she hadn't known Mara's shadow was already creeping through their lives. Now it felt like the same terrible prelude. But this time, Mara wasn't just lurking in the background, she was inside. Hale pushed the door open with a quiet but firm motion, stepping through first. Elaine hesitated for only a second before stepping inside, her pulse quickening with each passing moment. The house was eerily quiet. It was too quiet, too still. The front room looked untouched, the usual warmth of her home seeming distant. Hollow. She walked through the foyer and into the kitchen, her eyes scanning the space. The drawers. They were all open. Elaine's breath hitched. She could feel her pulse rising as she took in the scene. The kitchen drawers pulled out, items scattered across the countertops and floor, as though someone had been looking for something in a hurry. It wasn't just a break-in. It was personal. The chaos felt deliberate, as if whoever had done this wanted to send a message. Hale stepped forward, his eyes sharp, scanning the mess. "Mara was here. Recently," he said, his voice low but certain. Elaine stood frozen in the doorway, the weight of his words settling in her chest. Mara had been in her house, had rummaged through everything, but why? What was she looking for? And more importantly, where was Ethan? She felt the panic creeping back up her throat. She had to think, had to focus. But every step she took felt like she was walking through molasses, the fear dragging her down. Then she saw it. A small faded Polaroid resting on the kitchen table. Her fingers trembled as she reached for it, lifting it slowly from the surface. The picture was of Ethan, her son, at the airport earlier that morning. His face was weary, but the image wasn't taken by accident. It had been staged. He had been watched. Elaine's pulse skipped as she studied the photograph. She flipped it over, heart pounding, and read the handwritten message scrawled on the back. "You raised a liar." The words hit her like a punch to the gut. Her vision swam for a moment and she could barely catch her breath. Mara had been stalking Ethan, had been watching them both for days, weeks maybe. Every step they had taken had been carefully observed, planned for. And now Mara was drawing closer, cornering them both. Elaine swallowed, her throat tight, barely able to whisper the words that hung in the air. "She's hunting us." Hale stepped forward, his eyes never leaving the picture. He didn't say anything at first, but there was a deep understanding in his gaze. He could see it now too. This wasn't just about revenge. This wasn't just about making Ethan suffer. It was about something much darker, more sinister than either of them had imagined. Elaine's mind raced. She's been here. Mara's been inside my house. The image of Ethan on the photograph, so carefully taken, twisted in her mind like a knife. This wasn't just about breaking him down emotionally. It wasn't even about destroying their lives. It was about something deeper, something far more calculated. And then she remembered the coldness in Mara's voice, the message, the post. "I'm ready to collect." Her breath caught again. "Mara's gone," Hale said, his voice quieter now, more contemplative. He looked up at her, his expression grave. "But she's left something behind. She's telling us to follow the trail. But we have to be ready for whatever comes next." Elaine nodded, feeling the weight of those words settle deep into her bones. She was no longer just running to protect Ethan. She was running to protect herself. Because Mara was coming for her, and everything she had known was about to crumble into pieces. She was no longer just a mother trying to save her son. She was a target. And Mara wasn't finished yet. The game was far from over. Elaine sat in the sterile, dimly lit room of Paula's house, her hands resting on her lap, clenched into fists as if they could somehow keep her from unraveling. The quiet murmur of Paula's voice was all that filled the space, a sound so distant and soft that it barely cut through the storm of thoughts inside Elaine's mind. Paula, her voice strained with concern, was seated opposite Elaine at the kitchen table, a cup of tea trembling in her hands. Her lips trembled as she looked down at her own fingers, nervously twisting a napkin. The woman who had been Elaine's neighbor for years, a friendly, ever-present figure in her life, was now the bearer of a truth that threatened to tear apart everything Elaine thought she knew. "Ethan, he came to me last week," Paula said softly, her words carefully chosen, as if testing the waters of a conversation neither of them wanted to have. "He was scared, Elaine, terrified. I thought maybe it was just stress, with everything going on with Mara, but now I don't know." Elaine's breath hitched, her hands clenched tighter in her lap, the raw panic rising once again. "Scared of what?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper, afraid of what she might hear. She needed to know, but she also feared the answer. Every new piece of information seemed to strip away another layer of safety she thought she had with Ethan. Paula's gaze flicked to the side, avoiding Elaine's eyes as she spoke. He said Mara was messaging him from burner phones, numbers that didn't trace anywhere. She kept threatening him, threatening to expose what he did. Paula paused, her brow furrowing. She said she was going to ruin him, Elaine. He didn't say what she meant, but he was so scared. So afraid she was going to tear everything apart. He was afraid for his job, for his reputation. Elaine felt the words slice through her. Her stomach twisted with the sharp realization of how much Ethan had been hiding, how much she had never known. Mara's threats had always been shadowy, intangible, and she had convinced herself Ethan was in the clear. But now, she felt the ground shifting under her, and the pit in her stomach grew deeper. She leaned forward, her voice trembling. Expose what, Paula? She needed to understand, needed to know what could possibly have been so devastating that Ethan would remain silent about it all this time. Paula shifted in her seat, her eyes now downcast, avoiding Elaine's gaze. The hesitation in Paula's voice was palpable. He said, "Something happened during the marriage, something that might have ruined him if anyone found out." Elaine's mind spun, unable to comprehend the gravity of the words Paula was dropping. Something happened? What could have been so terrible, so unforgivable, that it drove Ethan to keep it a secret from the one person he should have trusted most? Her heart raced, and she felt a cold shiver creep down her spine. What had he done? Her mind flashed to all the quiet moments she'd spent with Ethan, all the times she'd believed she knew everything about him. Why didn't he tell me, Paula? Elaine's voice was a mixture of pain and disbelief, the weight of her son's silence crushing her. Why didn't he come to me if it was that bad? Paula's eyes welled with sympathy. I think he was trying to protect you, Elaine. He didn't want you to carry that weight. Whatever it was, he thought it was better if you didn't know. I think he kept it from you because he wanted to keep you safe. Elaine felt the tears threaten to spill, but she fought them back. She couldn't allow herself to break, not yet. Not when everything was unraveling. Safe. Her son had kept her safe. But at what cost? She tried to steady her breathing, the suffocating pressure of everything that had been hidden crashing down on her. Hale, who had been standing quietly by the door, finally spoke. His voice was calm but stern. We need to find his estranged coworker. Whoever was involved in this secret. The person who Mara is using to try to destroy Ethan. It's not just about Mara anymore. It's about what she knows. We can't afford to wait. Elaine blinked, dragging her thoughts back to the present. She looked up at Hale, who stood with an air of quiet determination. His sharp eyes met hers, and for the first time, she saw something different there. Something that wasn't just about solving the case. There was an understanding, a recognition of the personal stakes that had dragged both of them into this nightmare. We need to move quickly, Hale continued, stepping forward. If Mara's targeting Ethan's past, we need to figure out what she's holding over him. And we need to find out who else is involved, because this is only going to get worse. Elaine nodded slowly, her mind still reeling from Paula's revelation. Ethan had kept so many secrets from her, secrets that now seemed to have an even more dangerous weight than anything she could have imagined. What had he done, and why hadn't he told her? Her chest tightened as a chilling thought struck her. Had Mara known all along? Had this been her plan from the start? To take everything Ethan loved and destroy it piece by piece? Elaine, Hale said softly, his voice cutting through her spiraling thoughts. We don't have much time. Let's find that coworker. We need to know what we're up against. Elaine stood, the weight of the past few days crashing into her like a tidal wave. The storm outside mirrored the one in her chest, the relentless, unyielding sense that everything was falling apart, and that they were still far from the truth. With one last look at Paula, who now sat with her head lowered in regret, Elaine turned and followed Hale out of the house. She didn't have all the answers, but she knew one thing with terrifying certainty. Mara wasn't finished. Not by a long shot. And neither was the truth. The clock was ticking. And they were running out of time. Elaine sat in the dimly lit office of the aviation company, her hands tightly clasped in her lap as she tried to steady her breath. The sterile air inside felt suffocating, every minute dragging her deeper into the storm of confusion and dread that had consumed her life. The conversation she had just overheard, the revelations Paula had shared, had shattered everything she thought she knew about her son. And now, sitting across from one of Ethan's old coworkers, she had the uncomfortable feeling she was about to learn more truths that might break her even further. The man sitting across from her, Adam, an older colleague of Ethan's, was clearly uneasy. His posture stiff, his eyes darting nervously between Elaine and Hale. His hands were folded on the table, but they trembled ever so slightly, betraying the nervous energy he was trying to hide. Hale had made it clear to Adam that this wasn't a simple discussion. It wasn't just about the day-to-day logistics of Ethan's career. It was about the dark secrets Mara had been pulling from the shadows. Secrets that might destroy Ethan's life. Adam, Hale began, his voice calm but authoritative. We need you to be honest with us. What do you know about Ethan and Mara? What happened between them? The older man's jaw clenched, and for a moment, he didn't speak. It was clear this wasn't the first time he'd been asked about Mara and the tension that had once crackled between her and Ethan. But there was something more to it this time, something that made him hesitate. Elaine could feel the air thickening with every second of silence. Her pulse raced as she tried to read his face, wondering if he would be the one to provide the answers that could make sense of the twisted web Mara had so carefully woven around Ethan. Adam shifted uncomfortably in his seat before finally speaking, his voice low. Ethan. He never hurt Mara. Not the way she claimed. That wasn't him. No matter what she said. He looked at Elaine, his gaze earnest but strained. But, there was a time when she hurt herself. Elaine's breath caught. She leaned forward slightly, her eyes narrowing. What do you mean? How did she hurt herself? Adam's hands tightened on the table as he looked down, clearly reluctant to go deeper. I don't know all the details, he said, almost apologetically, but there was an incident, a few years ago, just before the divorce. Mara, well, she cut herself. And when she did, she blamed Ethan. Elaine's heart stopped. She could feel the blood drain from her face as the reality of Adam's words sank in. Mara blamed Ethan. But for what? For a crime he hadn't committed? Adam sighed, running a hand through his hair, his expression pained. She said it was Ethan who did it, that he'd hurt her during an argument. But, and this is the part no one knows, Ethan covered it up. He protected her. To save her reputation, to keep her from losing everything, and to keep his career intact. He lied. He covered up what really happened. He told the people at the company that it was a mistake, an accident. That way, she didn't get into trouble. And he didn't lose his license. Elaine's world spun again, the weight of the confession sinking into her bones. Ethan had protected Mara from the consequences of her own actions, to the point of risking everything for her. His career, his future, his own reputation. He had done this for her, when all she had done was tear him down. But that wasn't the end of it, Adam continued, his voice tinged with bitterness now. Mara used that incident. She held it over Ethan's head for years. She blackmailed him, saying she'd expose the truth, destroy his career if he didn't do what she wanted. Elaine's head spun as the pieces began to fall into place. Mara's control over Ethan wasn't just emotional. It was financial, professional, and now it was all coming to a head. She's been blackmailing him? Elaine's voice cracked as she asked the question, her heart heavy with the realization that Mara had manipulated Ethan, twisted him into a position where every choice he made had been under her thumb. And the worst part was, he'd kept it a secret. For her. Adam nodded, grimacing. She threatened to expose him at every turn, and now she claims she has proof. Proof that Ethan hurt her, that he did it on purpose. She's going to use that, Elaine. She's going to ruin him for good. Elaine's breath caught, her body growing numb with shock. Proof? What kind of proof did Mara have? She had never believed Mara's accusations, but now it seemed like everything was about to implode. Hale's eyes narrowed as he processed what Adam had said. He stood up slowly, his gaze shifting to Elaine as he spoke with quiet urgency. If she has proof, she wants Ethan arrested. But if she's gone this far... Hale's voice grew darker, more serious. She might want him gone for good. Elaine's stomach turned at the words. Gone? What do you mean gone? She whispered, her voice trembling with a horror that could no longer be contained. Hale met her gaze, his eyes hard and resolute. I'm saying, Elaine, that if Mara's reached the point where she's willing to burn everything to the ground, Ethan might be her final sacrifice. Elaine stood abruptly, the weight of Hale's words crashing over her like a tidal wave. Sacrifice? Her mind reeled. She had already lost so much, but to lose Ethan, to lose him to this twisted game Mara had been playing for years. No, it couldn't happen. Not after everything he had been through. Her pulse raced as she turned to Hale. Then we need to find her, now, before it's too late. Hale didn't hesitate. He motioned to Adam, who was still seated, his face pale. You're sure about this? About Mara? About everything she said? Adam nodded slowly, eyes downcast, guilt and fear heavy in his gaze. Yeah, I'm sure. But I don't think we have much time. If Mara's really got that proof... His voice trailed off, unable to finish. Elaine's stomach twisted again, and she took a shaky step back. Then, we need to move faster, she said, her voice trembling with fear and resolve. We're not just running to save Ethan anymore. We're running to save him from a fate worse than prison. We need to find Mara. And as the words left her mouth, she realized something else. Mara had been ahead of them every step of the way. This wasn't just a fight for Ethan's freedom. It was a race against time to stop a woman who had nothing left to lose. And if they didn't move quickly enough, it would be the last race they ever ran. Elaine's eyes were fixed on her phone, the screen still dark. Every second that ticked by felt like a hammer blow to her chest. The silence was unbearable. The unanswered questions clawed at her, each one more desperate than the last. Ethan had to be okay. He had to be. The drive had been a blur, her mind spinning with Hale's words and the terrifying thought that Mara had a hand in everything, had been playing this game from the start. But that wasn't enough. She needed to hear from Ethan. She needed to know that he was alive. Her fingers gripped the phone tighter, willing it to ring. The air in the room was thick with tension. The quiet broken only by the sound of Hale pacing nearby. He had been on the phone with various authorities, coordinating their next move, but his eyes kept darting to Elaine as if he knew she was on the verge of breaking. Time seemed to stretch endlessly. Just as Elaine thought she might collapse under the weight of it all, the phone vibrated in her hand. Her breath caught in her throat. For a split second she couldn't move, couldn't process the reality that the call was finally coming through. She shot up from the chair, her legs unsteady, and almost dropped the phone in her haste to answer. "Ethan!" she gasped, the words spilling out before she even pressed the button. She heard the faint crackling of the line, a low hum of static, then a shaky breath. And then, his voice. "Mom, I didn't see her on the flight because she wasn't on it." Elaine's blood ran cold. She stumbled backward, her hand trembling as it gripped the phone. "What?" "Ethan, what do you mean? What's happening?" Her voice cracked, the panic flooding back like an unrelenting wave. I don't know, Mom," Ethan whispered, his voice ragged, like he was barely holding himself together. "She's here. She followed me off the plane somehow. I don't know how. Elaine's heart raced in her chest, each word pushing her closer to the edge of hysteria. Ethan, where are you? What's going on? Tell me. I can help you. Just tell me where you are. There was a sudden noise on the other end of the line. A crash, followed by a muffled gasp. Ethan's breath caught in his throat, a low sound of fear. The noise was followed by more crashing sounds. A chaotic shuffling. Elaine's pulse thundered in her ears, her hand pressed harder against the phone, her knuckles white with strain. "Ethan, answer me!" Elaine screamed, her voice cracking with desperation. "Ethan, what's happening? Are you okay? Please." There was a sharp intake of breath. The line crackled again, this time with a strange hiss of distortion. And then, nothing. Silence. Elaine's heart plummeted as the air around her thickened. The phone was still pressed to her ear, but all she could hear was the buzzing, the empty static. "Ethan! Ethan! Please, answer me!" Her voice was frantic, a tremor in every syllable, but there was no response. Her throat closed as the fear grew, a cold, suffocating weight pressing down on her chest. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't think. Then, just as she was about to drop the phone in frustration, the line cut through with a cold, mocking voice. "Did you miss me, Elaine?" Elaine froze, the blood draining from her face. The voice was unmistakable. "Mara." Elaine's hand shook violently, the phone slipping in her grasp as Mara's words echoed in her mind, each syllable more venomous than the last. "Mara," Elaine whispered, her voice hoarse with a mixture of fear and fury. "Where is he? What have you done to my son?" There was a sickening laugh on the other end. The kind of laugh that sent a chill crawling down Elaine's spine, that sent every nerve in her body screaming with dread. Then, the line went dead. The phone fell from Elaine's hand, hitting the floor with a muted thud. Her breath came in ragged gasps as her hands gripped her head. Trying to keep herself from spiraling into total panic, it felt like the walls were closing in. Hale, who had been standing by the door, stepped forward quickly. "Elaine?" His voice was sharp, but there was something else in it now. Something deeper. Something that spoke of a shared understanding of the danger that was closing in. Elaine turned to him, her eyes wide with terror, her chest heaving. "She has him, Hale. Mara has Ethan. She's going to do something to him." Hale's face hardened and he was already moving, pulling his phone from his pocket. "We're going to get him back, Elaine. We need to move. Now." But Elaine's mind was already racing ahead, her thoughts scattered in a dozen different directions. She couldn't lose Ethan. Not like this. "Mara's playing us," Elaine said, her voice cold with realization. "She's playing me." Hale's eyes narrowed. "We'll get to him. We just need to find her, and then we'll—" Elaine cut him off, her voice tight with fury. "She's not going to stop until she's destroyed him. Until she's destroyed us. I have to find him. Now." Hale's gaze softened for a moment, but his tone was resolute. "We'll find him, Elaine. We'll bring him back." But as they moved toward the door, Elaine's mind couldn't shake the haunting words that echoed in her mind. Mara wasn't just after Ethan anymore. She was coming for both of them, and time was running out. The hum of Hale's phone was a constant buzz in the otherwise silent room. Elaine barely registered the words Hale was speaking as he stood, eyes fixed on his screen. His jaw was tight, his movements brisk and precise. It was like he'd snapped into a mode of cold efficiency, the kind of man who always had a plan. But Elaine's mind was elsewhere. Her heart was still racing from the call, the brief contact with Ethan, the terror that gripped her chest. Every second since Mara's mocking laugh had felt like an eternity, each beat of her heart echoing louder than the next. She couldn't lose him. Not like this. Elaine. Hale's voice cut through the fog in her mind, pulling her back to the present. We've got a location. Elaine's pulse quickened. She looked up, her hands gripping the edge of the table as she leaned forward, eyes locked onto Hale's. Where? Where is he? Her voice cracked, desperation clawing at her throat. Hale didn't waste time with pleasantries. His phone just pinged from an abandoned airfield. There's a hangar near Denver, maybe 5 miles south of the city. Elaine's body tensed at the mention of Denver, the city she had spent years thinking of as a place of safety, of routine. But now, it felt like the last place she ever wanted to be. The last place her son could be safe. She didn't think. She just moved, pushing past Hale before he could finish speaking. She was already at the door, her mind racing. Elaine. Hale's voice stopped her in her tracks, just as she reached for the door. His tone was sharp, a command disguised as concern. We're not sure what we're walking into. I need to make sure the team's ready before we head out. This could be a trap. Elaine turned, her face pale but resolute. I don't care, she said, her voice low but filled with raw emotion. If she touches him, Hale, I won't survive it. I'll die right along with him. Her words hung in the air like a dark promise, something more than just grief, a desperate certainty that was beyond reason. Hale's eyes softened for just a moment, but there was no hesitation in his next words. He knew she wasn't asking for permission, and at this point, he wouldn't try to stop her. We're going, he said, the finality in his voice giving her no room to argue. He grabbed his jacket from the back of the chair, and with one last look at Elaine, he motioned toward the door. The drive was a blur. The rain had picked up, turning the world outside into a smear of gray. The windshield wipers worked furiously, but it barely made a dent in the deluge. The car's headlights cut through the storm like a knife, but Elaine barely noticed the outside world. All that mattered was the destination. The tension inside the car was unbearable. Hale was focused on the road, his expression unreadable. Elaine sat rigidly beside him, her hands folded tightly in her lap, the silence between them as thick as the storm outside. Every few minutes, she'd glance at the phone in her hand, willing it to ring, to bring Ethan's voice back to her. But there was nothing. The phone remained as silent as the storm crashing against the car. Her mind replayed the conversation, the chaos in Ethan's voice, the crashing noises. She couldn't stop imagining the fear in his eyes, the desperation in his voice. Mara's not done with him, she said suddenly, her voice breaking the silence. She's going to use him to destroy everything. First, it was his career. Now it's us. She wants to break him completely. And I don't know if he can survive it. Hale's jaw clenched as he kept his eyes on the road. She's playing a dangerous game. But we're going to stop her, Elaine. We'll bring him back. Elaine didn't reply. She wasn't sure if she even heard him. What was left of the world they knew? What was left of Ethan? Of everything she had been trying to protect? The road ahead seemed endless. The rain battered the car, the sound deafening as they pressed on. Almost there, Hale said, his voice low, but even he couldn't hide the strain in it. His knuckles were white on the steering wheel, his jaw tight with focus. They both knew what this meant. This was no longer just a rescue mission. It was a race against time, and they were running out of it. Elaine stared at the road ahead, barely noticing the rusted sign that they were nearing the outskirts of the airfield. The hangar loomed in the distance, its outline barely visible through the rain. As they drove closer, Elaine's stomach turned. It looked abandoned, lifeless, a perfect place for Mara to do whatever twisted thing she had planned. Hale slowed as they pulled into the gravel parking lot, his eyes scanning the area. The hangar's doors were half open, the rusted metal groaning as the wind pushed against it. The place looked like a ghost town, empty, silent. Elaine's pulse quickened, the dread settling like a weight in her chest. They had arrived, but it felt like walking into the mouth of a predator. Every instinct in her screamed that Mara was already waiting, that the worst had yet to come. "I don't like this," Hale muttered, his eyes narrowed, scanning the area around them. Elaine opened the door before he could stop her, stepping out into the rain. The sound of her boots hitting the wet ground was sharp, the only noise in the eerie quiet of the abandoned airfield. She didn't wait for Hale. She couldn't. Not now. They were too late. A scream echoed from inside the hangar. Elaine's heart froze. The sound of that scream, broken, terrified, shattering everything in her. It was Ethan. She knew it. "Ethan!" she screamed, running toward the hangar, her breath coming in ragged gasps. "Elaine, wait!" Hale shouted, his voice strained, but it was too late. Elaine was already inside, and in the silence that followed, the truth became clear. They weren't just fighting to save Ethan anymore. They were fighting to survive. The sound of Elaine's boots pounding against the wet concrete of the hangar echoed in the stillness, the rain a constant hiss against the roof above her. She barely registered Hale's shout for her to wait. She was already inside, her mind screaming, her pulse racing, the silence around her deafening. The hangar was dark, the only light coming from the flickering overhead bulbs. The air smelled of rust and damp, thick with the scent of old oil and metal. The vast emptiness of the place only amplified the tension, the weight of it pressing on her chest as she squinted into the shadows. And then, she saw him. Ethan was slumped in a chair, his arms bound tightly behind him, bruises blossoming along his face and arms. His head was bowed, his body sagging with exhaustion, and Elaine's heart stopped as she took in the horror of him, her son, who had been through hell, tied and alone. "Mara!" Elaine's voice cracked, a raw shout that cut through the air. She could feel the tears starting to burn at the corners of her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. Not yet. Not until Ethan was safe. From the corner of the hangar, Mara stepped forward. Her face was pale, streaked with mascara, her eyes wild, feral. The metal rod she held trembled in her hand, as if it were an extension of her rage. She was shaking, but it was the kind of shaking that came from pure, unfiltered fury. "Mara, stop!" Elaine yelled, stepping between her son and the woman who had caused all of this. She could feel the heat of Mara's anger before the woman even spoke. "He ruined me!" Mara screamed, her voice raw and broken. "He ruined everything I worked for!" She raised the rod, the threat in her eyes unmistakable. Elaine's hands trembled as she clenched her fists at her sides. "No, Mara, you ruined yourself." Her voice was steady now, cold and unforgiving. Every word felt like it was cutting through the years of manipulation, of control, of the twisted relationship that had broken her son. Mara's eyes flicked to her, and for a split second, the insanity in her expression shifted to something more calculating. She took a step forward, the metal rod raised, her breath coming in sharp, quick bursts. Elaine felt the ground beneath her feet tremble. She wasn't afraid, not of Mara, but she knew what this could mean. The terror of seeing Mara harm Ethan again, the threat of her pushing him to the edge once more, made Elaine's chest tighten. Without thinking, she rushed forward, her body moving on instinct, trying to protect Ethan. But before she could reach him, a loud crack rang through the air. "Mara, stop!" Hale's voice boomed from behind them. Elaine whipped around, eyes wide, but it was too late. Officers burst into the hangar, their tasers aimed and ready. In an instant, Mara dropped the rod, her body convulsing as she fell to the floor with a violent jolt. She was unconscious before she even hit the ground, the effects of the taser immediate and severe. Hale rushed past Elaine, pulling her to the side as officers moved in to secure the area, quickly handcuffing Mara. Elaine's eyes never left her son. Ethan's head jerked up, his eyes glassy, wide with terror. The moment he saw Elaine, his body shook with the kind of relief that tore through him. His lips trembled as he tried to speak, his words barely a whisper. "Mom, I thought I was going to die." Elaine's heart shattered. She rushed to him, her legs unsteady as she dropped to her knees in front of him. The sight of him, tied up, bruised, broken, was too much to bear. But he was alive. He was here. And that was all that mattered. She pulled him into her arms, holding him tight, her hands running through his damp hair, her chest tight with emotion. "You're safe now. You're safe," she whispered over and over again, as if saying the words could make them true. Ethan collapsed against her, his body racked with sobs, the kind of cries that came from a place deeper than pain. He had been through so much, more than any person should endure. But now, he was free. The officers were securing Mara, but Elaine's focus was entirely on Ethan, her son, her heart. "You're okay, Ethan. I've got you," she said, her voice breaking as she held him closer. She didn't care that the rain soaked them both, that her clothes were drenched, or that the hangar was cold and empty. All that mattered was him. Hale stepped back, watching the scene unfold, his face etched with a mixture of exhaustion and relief. His voice was softer now as he spoke, almost like he was speaking to himself more than anyone else. "She almost destroyed him. And she almost destroyed you, too." Elaine didn't answer. She didn't need to. Everything she had been fighting for, every second of terror, every moment of helplessness, had all led to this. Ethan was safe. Mara was down. For now, they had won. But as Elaine held her son, her heart still racing, a quiet, gnawing thought pressed at the back of her mind. Mara had been playing a long game, and the truth, the real truth, was still waiting for them to find it. The battle wasn't over. And deep down, Elaine knew that whatever came next, they would face it together. The hangar was quieter now, its cold metal walls echoing only the soft hum of the officers securing the scene. Mara, handcuffed and slumped against a wall, was a mere shadow of the woman who had tormented them for so long. She was no longer the orchestrator of their nightmares, but just another prisoner in this twisted game. Elaine's mind, though, was still racing, her eyes never leaving her son. Ethan had calmed, but the tightness in his body remained, as if the terror hadn't yet been fully absorbed, as if every inch of his skin still felt the marks of Mara's abuse. Elaine held him close, her arms the only thing that seemed to offer him comfort, even as the weight of everything they had survived pressed down on them both. Hale, standing at a distance, was already on his phone with other officers, the remnants of his earlier composure now tinged with exhaustion. But he was still sharp, his mind clearly calculating what came next. Mara, however, had not given up. Her eyes flicked toward Elaine and Ethan with a mix of resentment and satisfaction. She hadn't spoken since the officers had arrived, but now, with the cold, calculating edge that had always marked her, she broke the silence. "You want answers, don't you?" Mara's voice was a low rasp edged with bitterness. Elaine's heart skipped, the words like a challenge, an invitation to face the truth, or whatever Mara had left hidden. But even after everything, Elaine wasn't sure if she could stomach it. Her grip on Ethan tightened, her protective instincts flaring. Hale stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. "If you have something to say, now's the time. If it's about your son—" Mara cut him off, a smirk tugging at the corner of her mouth. "It's not about Ethan anymore, Detective. It's about her." Elaine felt a sudden chill, her throat going dry. She could hear the smirk in Mara's words, feel the weight of what was coming. Mara pulled something from her pocket, a small USB drive that gleamed in the dim light. She held it up, and the taunting smirk deepened. "I'll trade this for immunity," she said, her voice dripping with mockery. It's the real secret. You can have it. The truth about everything. Your truth. Elaine's breath caught in her throat. Her pulse quickened as she looked between Mara and Hale. What's on it? Elaine's voice was hoarse. But the fear was clear. Mara's eyes locked onto Elaine's, the silence between them stretching long and tight. Your son wasn't the only one I followed, she said, her voice soft, almost regretful, as if enjoying the moment was part of the process. Hale took a step forward, his eyes narrowing as he studied the USB drive in Mara's outstretched hand. His voice was low but urgent. Elaine, stay back. We don't know what's on that. But Elaine didn't listen. She had to know. She had to understand what Mara was holding over them this time. She stepped forward, reaching for the drive as if the physical act of grabbing it would bring her closer to the answers she so desperately needed. Mara released the drive without a fight, but her eyes never left Elaine. As Hale plugged the USB into his phone, a low hum of anticipation spread across the room. The screen flickered for a moment, and then the footage began to play. Elaine watched in stunned silence, the images on the screen flashing before her. The footage was grainy, but it was clear enough. Months of footage, each shot carefully planned, every movement watched. The haunting reality of it began to sink in as the images unfolded, each one more chilling than the last. It wasn't just Ethan she had been stalking. Elaine's stomach churned as the camera shifted, showing her own house, her own movements, every step she had taken in the last several months, captured in ways she had never imagined. It was then that the true horror of it all began to hit her. Mara had not just been playing with Ethan. She had been manipulating both of them. Every moment she'd spent fearing for Ethan, thinking Mara was targeting him, had been a lie. Mara had manipulated Ethan into believing that Elaine was in danger, that she was the target of this entire ordeal. All the while, she had been laying the groundwork to frame Elaine herself. The footage cut to shots of Elaine, going about her daily life, walking through her house, even talking on the phone. It was like she was being stalked from a distance, unaware. Mara's voice cut through the room like a razor. I made Ethan think you were the one she was after. You're the one who's been threatened. You're the one who's been... Elaine couldn't breathe. The depth of the betrayal took her by surprise, each new twist plunging her deeper into a pit she couldn't crawl out of. The woman who had already broken her son, who had torn apart their lives, had been setting her up all along. Her own son had been a pawn in Mara's game, manipulated into turning on her. Elaine's face turned pale, her chest constricting as everything she thought she knew about this nightmare crumbled to dust. She had protected Ethan. She had fought for him. And now she was the one at the center of the storm. Hale's voice broke the silence, sharp and grim. You were the endgame. Elaine's knees buckled, and she steadied herself against the wall, the truth hitting her like a physical blow. No, she whispered, her voice breaking. Not anymore. The words fell from her lips, and for the first time Elaine realized that she had been living in Mara's twisted shadow for far too long. The game had changed. The truth had been revealed. And now they had to decide what came next, if they could fight back at all. But even as the officers moved in to secure Mara, Elaine couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Mara had just given them the truth. But the real battle was only just beginning. The days that followed the storming of the hangar felt like a blur to Elaine. The air around her seemed to hum with a quiet, almost imperceptible tension, an aftershock of the chaos, the aftermath of a battle that had felt like it might tear apart everything. Mara was in custody, her eyes deadened now that the game had ended. The officers had done their work, but they hadn't needed to stay long. The charges against her were heavy. Kidnapping, stalking, extortion, digital impersonation. The list went on. But even as the justice system began to close in on her, Elaine could barely find the strength to care. Ethan was still there, at home with her, but he was far away in other ways. The truth was, he had been through something so much darker than anyone had known, and though she could feel his presence in every corner of their house, he was just beginning to face it himself. Elaine stood in the kitchen, her hands shaking as she set the last of the dishes on the counter. It had been an ordinary task, one she'd done 100 times over, but now, it was as if her whole world had been upended. The weight of the silence in the house was overwhelming, but she couldn't let herself fall into it. Not now. Not yet. From the corner of the room, she heard the soft creak of the door, followed by the light shuffle of footsteps. She didn't turn. She already knew who it was. Ethan stood in the doorway, his eyes still distant. He looked so much like the boy she used to know, the one who used to laugh without worry, the one who would ask her for advice about everything. But now, his shoulders were sagging with weight. The boy was gone, replaced by someone who carried a burden no one should have to. Elaine didn't say anything at first. She didn't know what to say anymore. The truth had shattered them both. "I'm sorry," Ethan's voice cracked, the apology hanging between them like an old wound. "For not telling you. For not letting you in. I just wanted to protect you." Elaine's breath hitched. She didn't know if she could forgive him. Not yet. Not when the pain of the betrayal was still so raw. But she also knew the truth now. The whole truth. The years of manipulation, the torment of thinking Mara was targeting Ethan, had been part of Mara's game all along. "I know," Elaine whispered, her voice hoarse. She reached out slowly, her hand trembling as she brushed a strand of hair from his face. "I know, Ethan. And I'm here now. I'm not going anywhere." Ethan's shoulders shook, the dam breaking at last as the tears fell. He crumpled into her arms, and for a moment, it was like time stopped. Everything that had happened, all the horror, all the pain, seemed to fade as she held him. "I thought I could handle it," he sobbed. "But I couldn't. I couldn't keep pretending that everything was okay. I'm so sorry." Elaine held him tighter, her own tears threatening to break free. "It's not your fault," she wanted to say, but the words felt hollow. He had been played, manipulated, caught in a web of lies. But the real answer, the real healing, would come in time. It wasn't just about forgiveness. It was about rebuilding, about both of them learning to live with the truth and the scars that would remain long after the battle was over. The sound of the front door creaked open, pulling Elaine from her thoughts. She wiped her eyes quickly as Paula stepped into the kitchen, a wide smile on her face as she carried a large casserole dish. The warmth in her eyes didn't match the heaviness Elaine felt inside, but it was a welcome distraction. "I brought dinner," Paula said with her usual cheer, setting the dish on the counter. "It's nothing fancy, but I thought it might help, to lighten the mood a little." Elaine nodded, forcing a smile as she stepped aside to let Paula in. "Thank you," she whispered, feeling the weight of her exhaustion. "You didn't have to, but I'm glad you did." Paula hesitated for a moment before turning to Ethan. The room fell quiet as she studied him, her gaze softening. "I know it's been hard, Ethan," she said gently, "but I'm here. I'm always here." Ethan met her eyes, his shoulders still hunched, but there was something softer in his gaze now. "Thanks, Paula. I'm trying to figure it all out." Elaine watched the exchange, feeling a pang of gratitude for the neighbor who had been a constant presence in their lives. Despite the turmoil, there were small threads of hope still holding them together. Paula smiled faintly before setting to work, dishing out portions of the casserole onto plates. The sound of utensils clinking against the ceramic was oddly soothing, a reminder that life, even at its darkest, went on. Elaine sat down at the table, her hands folded in her lap. She glanced at Ethan, whose gaze was fixed on the plate in front of him. Her heart ached for the young man who had been lost in this nightmare for so long. But for the first time in what felt like forever, she could see a flicker of light in him again, buried deep beneath the rubble. "I aged 10 years this week," Elaine muttered under her breath, the weight of everything catching up with her at last. The tension, the fear, the helplessness, it had all taken its toll. But there was something else, something that had only just begun to stir. The first glimmer of relief. As the two of them sat together at the table, Elaine knew the road ahead would be long, filled with recovery, rebuilding, and moments of quiet understanding. But for now, they were safe, and that was enough. For now. The airport was quieter than usual, the usual hum of voices and footsteps subdued under the weight of the morning's fog. Elaine stood by the observation window, her fingers pressed lightly against the cool glass as she watched the planes taxiing on the runway. Her eyes were fixed on the aircraft, but her thoughts were far from the distant noise of engines and jet turbines. It had been weeks since the storm, weeks since the truth had been torn from the shadows and thrown into the light. Since then, everything had shifted. The days were quieter now, but the silence was a little less heavy. Ethan had begun to find himself again, piece by piece, after Mara's twisted game had been dismantled. The months of manipulation, of fear, of being trapped in a world of lies had taken its toll on them both. But now, as she stood at the window, watching him prepare for his first return flight since the chaos, Elaine felt a sense of something different, something like relief. Ethan had been through therapy, each session a painful but necessary step toward understanding what had happened, what he had been forced to endure. They had rebuilt their connection, rebuilt their trust. But the scars remained. Quiet reminders of the darkness Mara had dragged them through. And yet, there was a strength in him now that hadn't been there before. A quiet resolve. She could see him now, through the glass, walking across the tarmac, his uniform sharp, his posture straighter than she had ever seen it. There was still that look in his eyes, familiar, but changed. But there was also something else. Hope. Or maybe it was simply the promise that he was still moving forward. Elaine's chest tightened as she took a slow breath, her hands steadying on the glass, the world outside fading as her mind focused on the moment ahead. The sound of the gate's door opening behind her broke the silence, and she turned slightly to see Hale step into the observation area, his presence as calm as ever, but with a quiet understanding in his eyes. "He's ready, Elaine," Hale said, his voice low, but with a warmth that cut through the cool distance between them. "It's his first flight back, and he's making it through. You've both made it through." Elaine nodded, her throat tight. She wasn't sure if it was the gravity of the moment or the sheer exhaustion of everything that had led up to it. "It's hard to believe," she said, almost to herself, her voice cracking as she spoke. "After everything, we've come this far." Hale's gaze softened, but he didn't say anything more. He understood the weight of it all, the weeks of trauma, the slow recovery, the deep, quiet fear of what might happen next. But for now, it was enough. The future wasn't something they could fully see, but it was theirs to shape, step by step. The announcement came over the loudspeaker, breaking through her reverie. The plane was ready for departure. Elaine's hands tightened around her purse, the weight of it grounding her in the present. "Tower, this is Captain Foster ready for departure." The voice over the intercom was calm, professional. Elaine's heart gave a little jolt as the words cut through the hum of the airport. Then a second voice, a quieter one, slipped through the static. The words, just for her. A soft whisper beneath the professional call. "Mom, I'm safe now." Elaine's breath caught in her throat. For a moment the world seemed to stop. All the fear, the uncertainty, the years of pain and doubt felt like they faded into the background. There was only the sound of his voice, steady and sure, and the weight of the words that she had needed to hear for so long. Her chest tightened, tears rising unbidden to her eyes. Relief, like a warm light, flooded through her, pushing back the lingering shadows. It was a feeling she had forgotten, so simple, so pure, and yet it was everything. The intercom crackled again, pulling her back to reality. The plane was lifting into the sky, climbing steadily, just like Ethan. Elaine didn't move from the window, her eyes following the plane as it soared higher, disappearing into the soft gray clouds above. For the first time in weeks, she could breathe again. The weight of the past had not disappeared entirely, but it no longer held her in its grip. There was a future now, one that was slowly, carefully, beginning to be rebuilt. As the plane vanished from view, Elaine whispered to herself, her heart finally beginning to settle. The line didn't go dead this time. We didn't either. And in that moment, everything felt possible again.